Uh, my name is Barbara Levin, and my mother was Toby Shussin Levin. My grandfather and grandmother were Abraham and Sarah Shussin, who lived in Minneapolis. Um, I am technically the fourth born, but the third surviving child of my parents, Ralph and Toby Levin. My mother had 8 kids in 9 years, two stillborns, and it ended up to be girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy. We were all about 2 years apart. My mother was very organized, she used to say. My grandmother and grandfather, uh, I only knew my grandmother for the first 5 years of my life. She died of Parkinson's. My grandfather was a tailor. He seemed little to me, even though I was little. And he was, but I guess he was only little in comparison with my father, because my father seemed like a larger than life man. Uh, my grandfather was always dapper. He got up every morning and always wore a suit and tie, preferably a three-piece suit, one he had made. He had so many suits and just immaculate. And I remember him smoking cigars and polishing his shoes and ironing his shirts. He ironed a lot. He lived with us the last 3 years of his life. And we lived in Marengo, Illinois, which was the middle of nowhere. Or, as my mother would say, it was in Kishinev. I tended to think it was a little left of Kishinev because there really was very little there. However, my father had grown up there, the only Jews in the small little town. My father had gotten there in the traditional and common Jewish migration story of his father used to take a Model T Ford and sell overalls to the farmers. My grandmother, my bubby, my father's mother, worried about him driving that much, so she suggested that they move to this little town, even though when I think about it now, it must have been very hard, just strangers in a strange land. There's a family myth about how my parents met. My mother used to talk about it a lot. She worked in a booking office. She used to book films, cinemas, cinema houses, movie houses. And a friend of hers, Charlene, said, "There's a guy I want you to meet." My mother was 29 years old and thought she was such an old maid. And my father came with Charlene to meet her in her office and asked her to come to lunch. And she agreed. And she went to lunch with him. And he arrived. They were going to meet at the restaurant. And she arrived, and he had a 5-pound box of candy and a dozen roses. And I thought, whoa. And she must have thought, whoa. She was being wooed deluxe. And they had a nice talk. They had a lovely lunch. She went back to work. He was leaving again. He had come up on a buying trip from Marengo, Illinois, up to Minneapolis. And my mother came home. She lived with her parents. She was the only one at home at this point. And she came home, and her mother, my grandmother, was in the doorway with a big smile on her face. And my mother didn't know what was going on. And she walked in, and my grandmother said to her, "Look what's been delivered for you." And it was a Philco radio, which the house did not have. It was much too much a luxury, and my father had bought it and had it sent over. One of the most romantic things I'd ever heard, especially when you know my mother's background. I'm not certain my grandmother and grandfather were, but their children were all very, very musical, and particularly my mother. The story was that I heard from my grandfather and I heard from my mother that she just kind of, they bought a piano, they had a piano in the house, and she just kind of crawled up to the piano when she was 3 years old and started playing. And she played her whole life. Some of my earliest memories are listening to my mother play the piano, and she would play us to sleep. She played every night after a long day of work. She could play anything. She played by ear, she could read music, she was fabulous. She played for the Andrews sisters when they were just starting out. She played in their rehearsals. She played in a band that was in their house. It was Auntie Mary was a good piano player. Uncle Dave he played violin, and he ended up playing viola. My Auntie Sybil had a great, beautiful singing voice. I'm not certain about my Auntie Bloomy. I'm not certain about my grandparents, but I know that my mother, Auntie Mary, Auntie Sybil, and Uncle Dave were very musical. She tried desperately to teach all of us. We all played instruments, and not too many of us had any talent. It seems to have skipped a generation. That's all right. But going back to my parents. So they had this Philco radio, and my mother realized she was being wooed. Then she didn't hear anything from him. He had gone back to Marengo. But a month later, she sent my father a postcard at his home and said, "I'll be coming in for business into Chicago. Would you like to meet again?" And it was Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1948. And he met her at the train station and took her over to her hotel. She was staying at the Palmer House, the famous Chicago hotel. He took her to lunch at the Wrigley Building, and then they went to see a play. They went to see at the Studebaker Theater. They went to see Mary Martin in South Pacific. It was right around the corner from the Palmer House. He walked her back to her hotel, and when they got to the hotel, he proposed. And she said yes. He came up a month later to Minneapolis, and they got married. My mother always said this, my grandmother called him a prince. My father was a prince. He was kind and gentle and perfect for my mother, who was fiery and excitable, but excited about everything. And my father was just kind of quiet and intellectual and adored my mother, and vice versa. So they got married, and during that initial lunch that they had, my father had asked my mother, if you could go anywhere, where would you like to go? And my mother told me later, she was always self-effacing, and she said, I wasn't very sophisticated, I didn't know. So I said, I've always wanted to go to Mexico. So a month later, they get married, and they go on their honeymoon, and they drive. And my father had planned it, and they went to Mexico. and then went all through the South. And she got married, quiet little ceremony, and they started driving on their honeymoon. And my mother said she looked over and she looked at my father and she said to herself, I don't even know this man. It's true, they'd spent hours together. But they had a happy, happy life. They had 53 men, 53 very, very happy years together. They didn't fight, they adored each other, they were together 24 hours a day. Um, One of my favorite things, I was home visiting once, and these people had been married like 51 years at this point, and they had a routine, and my father was reading in one chair, and my mother was reading in another chair. My father was doing crosswording, like crosswords, and they both read a lot. And I was on the couch reading, and then all of a sudden my father goes, "Oh, this was a shock. My father never sighed. My mother sighed, but more for effect. But my father sighed, and my mother looks at him and says, Ralph, are you okay? And he went, oh, I'm so in love. I love that. That was the best thing.